Hello, I'm Premal Trivedi, interventional radiologist and health services researcher at the University of Colorado. And I'll be providing some tips on grant writing focused on timeline, budget, and environment. Um, when we think about the grant as a whole, really you want it to be a Michelin star meal here. And I think it's fair to say a lot of the attention and certainly cognitive faculty is focused on the aims page, significance, innovation, and approach. This is really the meat of the meal. Um, and the rest of the stuff that I'm talking about, the timeline, environment, budget, I would consider the accoutrement. But also, it frames the uh, grant in a way that they are absolutely, I think, critical to the success of the overall proposal. Um, it's I think you'd have something clearly missing if there was a weakness in the way that it all adds up, outside of the main portion here. So while perhaps receiving less attention, just want to highlight that these are critically important pieces. Now, often while attention tends to go to it at the end, both on the writing side and the review side, really the process for what's going to get into these sections starts even before you start writing the grant. So, hopefully before you write the grant, you considered in depth what and who you will need to execute the grant if it is funded, and that stuff goes into the budget and environment. And hopefully you've also thought about really how much time you're going to need to do it. This is really backtracking from when you consider, is this the right funding mechanism for the work proposed? You're going to have a good sense of how much time is supported and how much money comes along with the grant. And then thinking backwards from there, is the amount proposed a reasonable match to those basics of the proposal will get you to piece number two. And getting into the specifics of how much each piece of the grant will take helps you construct the timeline. So again, I think a lot of the considerations start even in the conceptual phase of the grant writing process. So let's delve into the budget and justification. This portion should account for and justify all the expenses needed to achieve the aims. And it's important to mention that these are the things supported by the grant and also those without support. Where are they coming from? Now, there's going to be natural tension between the grant limits and what you actually need. And I think that tension is healthy. It kind of should force the authors to think about working within the confines of the grant and thinking about what should be supported with the grant and what should be supported outside of it. And I think it's important to be realistic. A lot of us, certainly myself, have a little bit of trouble with being ambitious, optimistic, and in reality, everything takes a little bit more time and effort than one might think. So the more realistic you are, within reason, the better off it's going to be perceived. I don't think you get style points necessarily for being for promising a lot if it's not going to work out. So this is worth mentioning. The budget is typically not part of the score, but it is an important consideration because it pulls in, really everything about all the team members involved, their effort, and really how all of that accounted for. So while it's not explicitly scored, I think it's critical to the long-term success of the proposal. So let's split budget and justification into the components that are frequently used. And it's split into people, things, travel, and miscellaneous. And we'll focus on people and things because that's really where the majority of the budget is going to go. So in terms of personnel, you start with how much PI time is going to be needed. And again, who's going to be paying for this? Often in reviewing grants, we'll see missing pieces of how there's this, implicit assumption that time will be made up somehow. But I think that generally is less convincing than, for example, thinking about, well, is it going to be 10% time, 20% time over what period of the funding duration and who's going to support it, and ideally have a letter of support from a supervisor or department chair or division chief confirming this would go a long way. And then this is where a lot of the budgets tend to go, is what kind of analyst do you need or research associate, and who will pay for it and how much of the budget will go to that person. Where will you find this person and what will their specific duties be? Really filling this role out with some granularity. In terms of materials, it really gets at what things will you need access to, and of those, what do you need to buy? If you're not buying it, how will you procure them? And that gets into the budget justification and environment. So in general, these suggestions are built on common strategies for success, but also things that common failures or mistakes I see in reviewing grants. So hopefully these are helpful. One, ensure that all the work proposed is accounted for by a person with relevant expertise. The work should be done by the appropriate level of expertise. Resource should match need, and that's a good way really to practically construct a budget and the entire team. To buy things, I think it's important you remember to explain what they do. What does the thing that you're buying do, and why is that important? We tend to get into this thing where if we use something a lot, we just assume that everybody else knows about it. But often that's a challenge in interpreting budgets. Is if a random piece of software or something is listed off just with its trade name, it's hard to know why does that thing need to be bought for this proposal, and that just invites questions that aren't necessary. And then 3, explain any major changes in dollars over time. So let's say there's a $20,000 budget over 2 years, and you're reserving $15,000 for the second half rather than the first half. That's a big change over time. It's worth explaining why that might be necessary. Get the correct salary and benefit for personnel at your institution. You're going to have to do some rough estimation. There's usually a range, but as long as you're in the range, you're okay. You don't want to be caught short if it gets funded and it turns out the institutional salary for a professional research associate is much higher than what you proposed. And then this is the part that I struggled with certainly early on, and still occasionally do, is ensuring that the relevant folks in the department where this proposal emanates from and the grants office have time to review the budget. This is really the contract part of the grant, and so dollars are exchanged in exchange for work proposed, and you want to make sure that your institution is able to vet that and really able to support the promise being made. That generally tends to be 2 weeks in advance of the deadline. I know a lot of us, like myself, tend to work furiously towards the end of the submission timeline. So getting at least the budget piece over to the grants office or department finance officer is really important ahead of time. There are lots of good examples available online, lots of guides. Just Google it and you'll find plenty. I want to highlight, I've chosen some examples from the NIH website, which has a number of really great examples of funded grants that could be used for brainstorming your own. So I'll give you my own example from when I submitted. The budget started with the key personnel section, my own time, where was that coming from, and a letter of support saying, yes, this amount of time, we're not requesting any money for it, but it's going to be supported by the department. And then, of course, what kind of analysts I needed, how much time you'll see in year 1 and year 2 for the quantitative analyst, and how much time for the qualitative analyst, professional research associate in this particular example in years 3, 4, 5. And then the paragraph that follows is really what exactly are they going to do and who's going to supervise them, and where will I hire this person? Moving on to other pieces, I hadn't really requested much money for things, and so this gets into, if I'm a reviewer, I know that the proposal will require some hardware, software, data storage, and so I just sort of address it here with, we're not requesting any support because we already have it, and some of it comes from the department, some of it comes from elsewhere on campus, and just kind of accounting for everything. in an explicit manner. And then this gets at the last example of there was a additional funding request in the latter half of the study, and just getting at why do we not need that early on, or why do we need extra funding later on is kind of helpful to do. So getting into the timeline, the timeline breaks down the proposal into the sub-elements, really ideally aims and deliverables, but sometimes the aims kind of speak for themselves and the deliverables aren't necessary to graphically show. And it gets into how each will be done, or sorry, when each piece will be done. And it's typically mapped out in quarters, but it could be, 6 months or 12 months. It doesn't really matter. It's just getting into what piece will be done when during the study proposal period. And the more specific the deliverables that are discussed, the better, but again, try to be realistic. In terms of examples, here's one from my submission. So there were 3 aims, and for each aim, I kind of pulled in what are the major tasks that are being accomplished. And here's just one graphical way to show what is being done when. Since this was a 5-year grant, chose to do 6-month increments so that it wouldn't look too crowded. And this shows graphically when each piece of these things is being done. There's some overlap, for example, here between aim 1 and 2, where they can be done in parallel, and certain activities of aim 2 can be done in parallel. So that is easily visually demonstrated here. Here's another example from the NIH website that I highlighted ahead of time. This is an example of specific tasks within an aim and when they will be done. It's sometimes much easier to comprehend this kind of data, pulled in visually in a table. It's an efficient way of demonstrating what will be done when, and that, truly everything can be covered within the study period. All right, finally, the environment. So what is this? It really addresses the question of, is there enough institutional resource and expertise to accomplish the aims, right? So, for example, if you're proposing something on, like, I don't know, quantum computing, the question is, do you have a quantum computer? Do you have do you have someone doing quantum computing right now? That kind of thing. So it's important to have sort of a big picture perspective and the nitty-gritty details, and that can be hard approaching this. And the way to navigate that tension is to try to really focus on what is the content needed to support the procedure, the proposal at hand. Often institutions will have a lot of strengths, and you can highlight all of them, but then it becomes more dilute. And we instead focusing on what are the things that really buttress this group and this environment for being the group to do the proposal is the right approach. And again, this is an example from my grant submission. Not that they, my submissions are particularly excellent or anything, but just as an example of these concepts, the Department of Radiology, for example, I thought about, here are all the things I'm going to need, and then I highlight, well, through my affiliation with the Department of Radiology, by the way, this is what it is. It's X number of faculty, treats these many patients. You could even really address if you're proposing treatment, inclusion of a certain patient population, or I don't know, using a certain equipment, talking about that equipment or how many patients of that nature you see is a good place to do that here. And then talking about whatever resources are not coming from the department, where am I going to pull them from? Well, in this case, there are some institutes on campus that have some relevant expertise that I have access to through my membership, or through study team members, et cetera. So basically highlighting, what the institution is good at, what the department is good at, and why the combination of those resources is well suited to the proposal. And then I also get at, here's the nitty-gritty part is gets into the computer, the software, it might be fax, it might be other things, whatever it is, the little stuff that is going to be needed to execute the proposal, where is that coming from? So suggestions, again, geared towards the environment. Ensure that all the cognitive expertise needed to complete the aims is clearly demonstrated within the team. Don't assume that the reviewers know, just really highlight it. Highlight any relevant institutional resources, particularly known strengths that are well suited to the proposal. explain how you will access them. Is it you already have those resources? Do you have a standing agreement, membership, collaborative relationship? And then at some point list up all the little mundane things that you need access to, like a computer, office space, server, software, etc. So that's really it. And in a nutshell, to summarize all of these sections, that they really must convince the reviewers ultimately that this team in this environment will succeed if the proposal is funded. I think if you keep that in mind, really you're going to have an outstanding product. That's all I have. Thanks for your time.